Thank you. Good to be back in Riga. It feels like home. And thank you for inviting me. And I look forward to answering any of your questions. I think many of you around the table are aware of kind of changes we did in Estonia. So if you have more detailed questions, how in Estonia the museum sector is operated, I'd be happy to go in detail later. I just thought maybe give a couple of words about the key principles. In addition to my role in the ministry back 10 years ago, as you mentioned, I have recently been working with a number of museums as a strategic consultant. I work every year with around 10 to 15 museums. In all my years in this field, I probably written strategies for around 50 to 60 museums. I couldn't really count all the strategies. For many of them, for the biggest ones in Estonia, I work not on a project-based, but on a process-based. So, for example, I have been consulting for the last 4 years the Maritime Museum with the Seaplane Harbour, which is the most visited museum in Estonia and in the region, and also with the History Museum, with Estonian Art Museum, Estonian Open Air Museum. So the biggest museums are our long-term partners and clients that I work with daily or weekly. I also I was involved in this process of this reform of turning Estonian cultural institutions into foundations. Reform that started from early 2000s and is still ongoing. This reform, if you call it a reform, did not focus on museums only, but on all cultural institutions. I was the State Secretary for the Fine Arts, so my particular responsibility in the ministry was reforming all the Estonian national theatres, 8 of them, into foundations. Also the National Symphony Orchestra, the Chamber Choir, many other institutions, heritage institutions. From museums up to today, most of museums have turned into foundations, except one, which is the National Museum, the Estonian National Museum. Due to the big completion of their new building in Tartu and maybe some other issues as well, they now have a new director in the last week or so. So we will see if they will be turned into a foundation as well. We can maybe discuss what the foundation means more precisely, but in Estonian legislation, there is no separate status for the public foundation. So by the law, you can either be a public institution, a government institution operating under the kind of a government law, or alternatively, you can be a private foundation operating on a private law. Having said private foundation, you're still somehow in a semi-situation, because even if you're a private foundation, you can be, and most often you are founded by a government. So the state is your creator, it is still funded by the government, and there are few other laws that regulate some specific characteristics of those foundations. So even though you are a private foundation, you still have to follow some of the rules of the state property law, for example. But in essence, why we are here is that even though those small details or special occasions, these museums, these cultural institutions are operated as private institutions are, so they have a council, a governing board, a governing council, which makes all the decisions. It is appointed by the ministry, but there are rules how to man those councils. Usually they have 5 members. One needs to be the representative of the Ministry of Culture. One needs to be the representative of the Ministry of Finance. 3, if there's 5 of them together, then 3, and if there's 7 of them, then 5 come from other sectors. One is usually a business sector representative, either from a business, law, marketing, or someone like that. Then one is usually from that particular field of culture. So if it's a museum, if it's a maritime museum, if it's another type of museum, history museum, historian, for example, or museologist. And then one is usually someone who represents the, let's call it a civil society. So, for example, in the Maritime Museum, it is a contra-admiral who brings in, let's say, the maritime community. It can be some other people. So these are the usual rules, but this council, according to the law, once appointed for a period of time, they are responsible for everything. So now if you understand that kind of a logic, you understand what are also the biggest changes that come with this foundation format. Firstly, it means that the day-to-day management and even strategic management is brought from the ministry level to the institution level. Also, in the old times, the government, the ministry appointed or agreed the budget of that particular institution with several budget lines for activities, for salaries, for upkeeping, whatever. And then if there were some changes in the budget, every time you had to come back to the ministry and the budget had to be changed. So there was a lot of bureaucratic change. Now this is not the case anymore. The government just gives one line of a budget to that particular institution, the museum, and then the budget is being decided within that institution. This can be changed many times a year if necessary, so it's extremely flexible. It also brings about the depoliticization of the entire sector, meaning that it's not anymore the minister or the ministry that appoints directors. Directors are being chosen by the council. There is not a law that says that all the directors need to be selected or elected by a public competition, but it is a principle, it's a culture policy principle. So in most cases there's an open call. Some cases the council can just appoint. Then also by the law, a member of so by the law you have to call that person not the director but a member of the board, and that member of the board by the law can be recalled any time without excuse. So there is a contract of 3 or 5 years, but by the law that contract can be finished any day. So it's extremely flexible in terms of management. There has been a lot of discussion whether this system is good or bad, and I'm happy to discuss both sides. But as a kind of a summary overview of this situation, I must say I'm a big fan of this system, because I've seen both. I've seen the time before and I've seen the time after, and it has improved situation significantly, and I'm happy to discuss how. But to understand or try to understand, so what does change with this situation, or what's different? I think you have to look at the management of an institution, of museum, for example, from two perspectives. One perspective is the institution's own perspective. So you have to look at it from the perspective of museum. And the other is the government perspective of the ministry. And you can look at it on both sides. So if you look at from the ministry point of view, I think the biggest change is from the ministry point of view. Because before that, Estonia had 26 governmental museums. So museums directly belong to the government. And in our system, we had one museum advisor. So the logic basically was that that one person sitting in the ministry, or in theaters, we had 8 theaters with more than 2,500 people working in those 8 governmental theaters, but you have one person in the ministry, advisor on the theaters, or advisor on the museum. So basically what we have to say is that that one person in ministry, or even if it's 10 people in the ministry, what doesn't matter, need to understand, need to know everything that goes within all those 26 museums in terms of financial irregularities, personnel issues, any scandals that might come, any management problems. And this is simply not possible. It is simply not possible. To have a system where the director comes regularly to the ministry and gives an overview of, once a year or twice a year, or it doesn't matter how many times, is just a one-way look at things. So the control mechanism was not there. And if it was there, it was very much just kind of official control. It didn't really go in deep enough. So from the ministry point of view, for the first time, you have much better overview of things. And we knew, for example, a couple of examples from mid-2000s where a few of the cultural institutions were near bankruptcy. We had one theater that actually we found out was almost bankrupt. The reason we found out that it was bankrupt was actually through the reorganization process of turning that state theater into foundation. Because if you turn them from a state institution to foundation, you need to basically you need to close the government institution. And closing means also financial documents. And then when we closed it, we saw it was basically bankrupt. Now, it wasn't because the ministry simply didn't understand or didn't care what the theater was doing, but it is possible for the director for some period of time to kind of fool the government, because you can always start selling tickets earlier, collect more money earlier from the market, use that money to produce next year. Kind of, you have this snowball effect of where you take more money earlier from the market, and you will never see that in one moment you actually use the next year ticket sales for current year's minus. And then there will be a catastrophe at one moment. Now this is not possible because of the control mechanisms with councils come much earlier. It is on time, there's a system. And to finalize, the second perspective you have to understand is the organization's own perspective. The positive thing about this is that for the first time ever, the directors have a partner in management. They have somebody to talk to, first of all, but also somebody to go for advice, go for contacts, go for input, whether this is support from the sector, whether it is financial support, whether it's people from both the Ministry of Culture, Ministry of Finance. So they have like a direct route to these ministries as well. Beforehand, it was more of a crime and punishment point of view, you know. If you did good, nobody really cared, nothing. If you did something bad, then it was a punishment. Now the punishment really comes very, very late, and you know, we hope that it will never come, because you have a partner in managing those institutions every day. So basically every month council gets an overview. By the law they have to meet every 3 months. Usually if everything is okay in the museum, then they don't need to come off more often together, but if there's a problem, they might even come every week. So what's the criticism, or why some of the directors don't like it? I would say that there's two kinds of, well, I wouldn't say that they don't like it anymore. It is more of, some of them think it's maybe a nuisance. And there's two types of directors that might say that. One type is those institutions that are doing very bad. And of course that makes their life difficult. Because if you are used to being like a little count in your kingdom, or you know, in your tower, and nobody really checks on you, and you only have to, maybe it was good enough to have a phone call friendship with a minister, and kind of, you know, you got everything you want. Now you have a management structure in between. So you have to have a responsibility, you have to prove everything you do, you have to have an overview. On the other hand, who also finds it sometimes nuisance is those museums that are doing excellent. Because if you're doing very, very well, that, for example, this is the case in the Maritime Museum, it works brilliantly. It worked before brilliant, it works now brilliant. It's a museum that earns profit. It has, you know, more than 350,000 visitors, lots of investments, so everything goes very well. And it was very well-run organization, one of the best run organizations in terms of management structures in Estonia. So now they feel that they don't gain much from the additional reform. They don't gain much from having a council, but the councillors, the members of the council, want to know everything in detail because they are also responsible. By the way, the members of the council are personally responsible, so with their own belongings. If they don't do what, according to the law, what they need to do, if they're not careful enough, then they need to cover from their own pocket the minuses that come. Anyway, so the councillors want to know a lot of information, so it has created a lot of extra work for the museum, but they don't really need to reform much inside. But I would say that this critique is just temporary, because they just were turned into the new format from the 1st of January, and it takes some time. So probably in half a year, when the council has started to work and the relationship between the council and the institution is settled, I think they will find the support. And there's even an example now, because Maritime Museum, for example, needs a large-scale investment for renovating the port in Tallinn, the port, the quays in the sea, and it will cost a lot of money. And so far, the museum was alone, so the director had to lobby the ministry alone. So now it's a completely different situation. Firstly, because they can lobby directly to the many ministries, director keeps lobbying, but also now you have very visible council. For example, the head of the council for the Maritime Museum is the rector of the Estonian Maritime Academy, who has a power to go and knock on the politicians' doors and get that support. The second member is one of the richest, one of the most connected businessmen who has a sea trade himself, meaning that he can lobby for the support in the business community. So you see, it's actually extra support for the director for their big investment needs.